We're going to talk about two well-known mural artists, Conor Harrington and a guy who goes by the moniker DZINE. But first, we're going to start with Conor Harrington, and he's gained quite a lot of attention over the last handful of years, doing these these figurative, semi-abstract, large-scale works depicting what looks like people to be in period uniform a lot of the times, especially colonialist uniform. They integrate a kind of painterly approach that pulls in elements of non-objective abstract expressionism, as well as appropriating the language of tagging. And of course, he's dealing a lot with a sort of hyper intense color, but he's pulling in this sort of art historical model of playing with and depicting traditional portraiture, traditional regal portraiture. And a lot of the work is fairly expressive and very confrontational. Some of the work really does straddle a line between abstraction and representation, and you'll see just sort of elements of the figure peeking in here and there, as he is a traditional studio artist as well as a muralist. And how he works is very much in a sort of back and forth negotiation between attacking the canvas or surface and then kind of canceling out what he did, leaving a sort of palimpsest or a ghost image of this remnant of his former approach. And this, of course, comes from the height of non-objective abstract expressionism that Willem de Kooning did, kind of scraping back, repainting, scraping back, and repainting, which is very similar to the way we think about the detritus of the urban landscape, especially when we're thinking about signage going over signage, going over signage, and decaying off of the walls. And we can't help but think of somebody like Jackson Pollock, this sort of bodily expression of the paint spatter as sort of being the noise of the body itself. And so in the pursuit of his work, I think the kind of content that he's trying to imbue is ultimately an investigation of sort of Western invasion and Western conflict as these countries go in and try to ultimately subvert the will of an already established community of people. And so a lot of these, what we would normally associate as a sort of regal, high-standing, haute portraiture, eventually start to decay. They start to sort of drip and lose specificity. And so the evidence of this investigation really is in the making of the work itself. And so they begin to sort of falter and glitch and get lost. He's playing with motion in images like this, but he's also playing with the drip as a sort of evidence of erasure. And what he's really looking at is metaphorically imposing these characters as nations, as the West, and this sort of futile violence that arises from this very romanticized vision of colonialism. And so how he makes the work is ultimately by paying models, and he uses photographic sessions with a professional photographer to source his images. And you can find quite a lot of those online. And of course, he's pulling from the traditional still life and images of bounty, because I think what he's examining ultimately is the pursuit of wealth and a standing in culture and in society. And so what we've got here is an image that he did, a mural in Brooklyn. We see that the wall is already a color, and what he's done is he's blocked out the negative shape of where he's actually going to paint in white, and then gridded it out to know exactly where he is as he's painting this image. And so here's the image in progress. You see the sort of drips and the focus on the red coat there, the very well-known British red coat. And then you see the image completed. And you'll begin to see images of flags as they sort of obscure the subject and then, in a way, suffocate the action. And I think it goes to without saying that he's very influenced by Caravaggio and the sort of drama and theater of the play act, of this sort of escape of action, and catching a moment that is of heightened theatricality. And I think what you would see in his mural work is really sort of the discovery of the image as it sort of affects the space around it. They're highly colorful, or they may really touch on this sort of what would normally be in the space, which would be tagging, right? And this pulls from, people like Gilbert Stuart, the American who painted many famous portraits of America's founders. And of course, the work of Joshua Reynolds, coming from England at the time. And it's this sort of posturing and almost propagandistic manner of posing the subjects in such a way as if they're looking off into the distance with their optimism. And I think, a lot of the time he's painting these images on top of already existing noise. And I think what this is really a sort of invasion of a space, which I think is what he's ultimately talking about, is the invasive quality of this power, this hierarchical stature. A little bit of studio work there. I think he's really marvelous at painting fabric and patterns. A little older work there. And you see that he's integrating the frame as a sculptural element as it sort of decays, because ultimately what he's talking about is stripping away those power structures. And then him at work in the studio. And obviously his work is very active. He has a practice of drawing as well, and sort of painstaking planning, even though the paintings don't really appear as though they're very planned, but more reactive. More of a conversation and a back and forth between the scrape and the covering and the spray paint and the oil paint. But I really do think that I don't think he would have as much compositional success if he didn't plan these out fairly well. And so here we have a fairly new one, and I'll be playing that. No, I won't, but I'll link that in the comments on the YouTube page. Next, we'll start with a guy named DZINE. He's known as Carlos Rolón legally. I had the great fortune of being able to hear him speak when I was in graduate school in Milwaukee. And he's a very, very active artist who has made and built success on a sort of voice that pulls from a variety of different media, but also a variety of different expressions of art, sneakers and skateboards, beyond just his fine art practice. And what you see here is an installation that he did, and not necessarily a mural, but definitely mural size, done on tiles. And so his voice really does pull from 1970s design, hard edge, geometric abstraction, but also designs that we would normally see in fabric and interior design. And of course, you see the use of spray paint here, but also the airbrush and frisket and masking. And this obviously pulls from artists like Victor Vasarely, who was a sort of op artist from the 70s and 80s. And here we have an installation of his done in situ of a great hall. And he's heavily influenced and definitely had a background as a tagger, as a sort of traditional graffiti artist. I don't know if there is a tradition of that, but if there were, he did definitely practice it. I believe that he grew up in Chicago or New York. I can't remember what he said, but ultimately this sort of color palette comes from this hyper intense, very acrid, acidic palette. And here we have a traditional sort of framed work. And of course, as he's creating these works, he's thinking about elements within the space that can reinforce this sort of opulence. And I would call his work neo-Baroque. I don't believe that this is painted on the walls. I think this is a custom designed wallpaper that he did. And of course, he's pulling from this sort of domestic space that we would see in the very, very, very wealthy, maybe the 17th or 18th century. So he's pulling these objects in to flutter and play with these things becoming so ornate that they infect your space. They force you to have to walk around it rather than walk under it and not have to acknowledge. This is an installation that he did, I believe, in LA. And he did one very similar to it at a place called Innova in Milwaukee, where he really did respond to the space itself in situ. So rather than designing it all out, it was much more of an organic process to see him work. And of course, he's pulling from, color theorist painters like Joseph Albers, the Bauhaus painter who really did define color theory. Him, with his research with Johanni Ten, and I think those intense colors and of course the interaction of those colors plays a role in the effective visual impact. Gene Davis is another hard-edged geometric abstract artist, sort of a stripe painter that I think you can't help but think about when you're looking at DZINE's work. And then here we have a DZINE work here with some gilding and then very, very painstakingly pinstriped off shapes to create a kind of kaleidoscope. And I think it's important to address the sort of psychedelic nature of his work as well. He's heavily influenced by poster art from the 70s during the war, the Vietnam War, and this sort of drug-addled aesthetic. And he really does think about the object in and of itself. Does the object reinforce, or the presentation of the object, reinforce the way and manner in which he's trying to make a commentary about this hyperbolic Baroque, neo-Baroque excess? He is a Chicano artist, and so he also is sort of, in some of his work, really referencing sculpturally this Baroque approach and application to objects that would normally be of that sort of culture, right? And so he's pulling from the lowrider bicycle there, the sort of tricked out lowrider bicycle, and making it so incredibly ornate that one wouldn't really be able to ride it. They become so ornate, at least the images themselves, that they become in some ways difficult to look at and assess. He has a whole line of marketing. Here we have some, I believe they're just simple lunch boxes that he has designed, that he's pulled into his branding. Another installation on walls, another lowrider that he's created. And so these begin to sort of touch on all of the things that are an amalgam, the teardrop, the Gene Davis stripe painting, the element of the Baroque, the highly ornate structures that one would see in wallpaper in the Baroque era. And they very much are a sort of visual candy. I don't think one can dismiss this as simply just candy, giving all sweetness and satisfaction without any substance or nutrition. I do think his work really is a flirtation with all that is art historical and sort of bringing it to the 21st century. Let's see if I can get that to play as well. I cannot get that to play. So that's my talk on DZINE and Conor Harrington. I will link you in the comments to the videos that I've linked in here that didn't work. Thanks for your attention.